Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Birth of Tragedy. We are up to Section 6. I'm calling them sections. I don't know what they are traditionally called. But I do have to make a quick note, and this is in reference to something I did about halfway through the previous video. I actually switched translations, and that is because the translation I was using, it's the same translator that I had used, I think, for two other of Nietzsche's works. I just realized how stuffy it sounded, and I came upon a free, more modern-sounding one, and so I'm going to use that. And the only thing that the person asked of anybody that would use his translation is that they give him due credit. So I'm going to do that both in the description and audibly, so everybody knows that is what I'm reading. And so far, I've really liked it. So I don't know if I will completely authorize it and say, yes, run to that one. I don't know anything about that because I've never read other versions of this work, so I can't give advice as to that. But so far, I've really enjoyed reading it, and I'll just leave it at that. The author's name is Ian C. Johnston. Ian C. Johnston. And I literally know nothing else about this man except that he translated this. So I guess anybody that wants to find out about him, they can go looking for it. But I'm just going to happily use his translation and go from there. So with that said, I'm going to start with Section 6. With respect to Archilochus, learned scholarship has revealed that he introduced the folk song into literature, and that, because of his achievement, he earned his place next to Homer and the universal estimation of the Greeks. But what is the folk song in comparison to the completely Apollonian epic poem? What else but the eternal mark of a union between the Apollonian and the Dionysian? Its tremendous expansion, extending to all peoples and constantly increasing with new births, testifies to us how strong that artistic duality of nature is, which, to use an analogy, leaves its trace behind in the folk song, just as the orgiastic movements of a people leave their traces in its music. Indeed, it must also be historically demonstrable how that period rich in folk songs at the same time was stirred in the strongest manner by Dionysian trends, something which we have to recognize as the foundation and precondition of folk songs. But to begin with, we must view the folk song as the musical mirror of the world, as the primordial melody, which seeks for a parallel dream image of itself and expresses this in poetry. The melody is thus primary and universal, for which reason it can undergo many objectifications in several texts. It is also far more important and more essential in the naive evaluations of the people. Melody gives birth to poetry from itself, over and over again. The forms of the strophes and the folk song indicate that to us. I have always observed this phenomenon with astonishment, until I finally came up with this explanation. Whoever looks at a collection of folk songs, for example, The Boy's Miraculous Horn, with this theory in mind, these images, with their bright colors, sudden alteration, and their wild momentum, reveal a power completely foreign to the epic illusion and its calm forward progress. From the standpoint of epic, this uneven and irregular word of images in the lyric is easy to condemn. Something, no doubt, the solemn rhapsodist of the Apollonian celebrations did in the age of Terpander. Thus, in the poetry of the folk song, we see the language of poetry most strongly pressured to imitate music. Hence, with Archilochus, a new world of poetry begins, something which conflicts very profoundly with the Homeric world. Here we have demonstrated the one possible relationship between poetry and music, word and tone. Word, image, and idea look for metaphorical expression in music and experience the power of music. In this sense, we can distinguish two main streams in the history of the language of the Greek people: language which imitates appearance, and images and languages which imitate the world of music. Let's think for a moment more deeply about the linguistic difference in color, syntactic structure, and vocabulary between Homer and Pindar in order to grasp the significance of this contrast. It would become crystal clear to some that between Homer and Pindar, the orgiastic flute melodies of Olympus must have rung out. Music, which even in the time of Aristotle, in the midst of an infinitely more sophisticated music, drove people into raptures of drunken enthusiasm, and with their natural effects, no doubt stimulated all the poetical forms of expression of contemporaries to imitate them. I recall here a well-known phenomenon of our own times, something which strikes our aestheticians as objectionable. Again and again we experience how a Beethoven symphony makes it necessary for the individual listener to talk in images, even if it's true that the collection of different worlds of imagery created by a musical piece really looks fantastically confused, even contradictory. The most proper style of our aestheticians is to exercise their lame wits on such a collection and to overlook the phenomenon which is really worth explaining. Even when the tone poet has spoken in images about his composition, for example, when he describes a symphony as a pastoral, one movement as a scene by the brook, and another as a frolicking meeting of peasants, these expressions are in any event only metaphors, images born out of the music, and not some objective condition imitated by the music. These notions cannot teach us anything at all about the Dionysian content of the music, and have no exclusive value alongside other pictures. Now, we have only to transfer this process of unloading music into pictures to a large, youthful, linguistically creative population in order to sense how the strophic folk song arose and how the entire linguistic capability was stimulated by a new principle, the imitation of music. If we can thus consider the lyrical poem as mimetic efflorescence of music and pictures and ideas, then we can now ask the following question. What does music look like in the mirror of imagery and ideas? It appears as the will, taking that word in Schopenhauer's sense, that is, as the opposite to the aesthetic, pure, contemplative, will-less state. Here we should differentiate as sharply as possible the idea of being from the idea of appearance. For it is impossible for music, given its nature, to be the will, because if that were the case, we should have to ban music entirely from the realm of art. For the will consists of what is inherently unaesthetic, but music appears as the will. In order to express that appearance in images, the lyric poet needs all the excitement of passion, from the whispers of affection right to the ravings of lunacy. Under the impulse to speak of music in Apollonian metaphors, he understands all nature and himself in nature only as eternal willing, desiring, yearning. However, insofar as he interprets music in images, he is resting in the still tranquility of the sea of Apollonian observation, no matter how much everything which he contemplates through that medium of music is moving around him, pushing and driving. Indeed, if he looks at himself through that same medium, his own image reveals itself to him in a condition of emotional dissatisfaction. His own willing, yearning, groaning, and cheering are for him a metaphor which he interprets the music for himself. This is the phenomenon of the lyric poet. As an Apollonian genius, he interprets the music through the image of the will, while he himself, fully released from the greed of his will, is a pure, untroubled eye of the sun. This entire discussion firmly maintains that the lyric is just as dependent on the spirit of music as is music itself. In its complete freedom, music does not use image and idea, but only tolerates them as something additional to itself. The poetry of the lyricist can express nothing which was not already latent in the immense universality and validity of the music, which forces him to speak in images. The world symbolism of music, for this very reason, cannot in any way be overcome by or reduced to language, because music addresses itself symbolically to the primordial contradiction and pain in the heart of the original oneness, and thus presents in symbolic form a sphere which is above all appearances and prior to them. In comparison with music, each appearance is far more a mere metaphor. Hence, language, the organ and symbol of appearances, never ever converts the deepest core of music to something external, but always remains, as long as it involves itself with the imitation of music, only in superficial contact with the music. The full eloquence of lyric poetry cannot bring us one step closer to the deepest meaning of music. 7. We must now seek assistance from all the artistic principles laid out above in order to find our way correctly through the labyrinth, a descriptive term we have to use to designate the origin of the Greek tragedy. I don't think I'm saying anything illogical when I claim that the problem of this origin has not once been seriously formulated up to now, let alone solved, no matter how frequently the scattered scraps of ancient tradition have been put together in combinations with one another and then again ripped apart. This tradition tells us very emphatically that tragedy developed out of the tragic chorus and originally consisted only of a chorus and nothing else. This fact requires us to look at the heart of this tragic chorus as the essential original drama, without allowing ourselves to be satisfied in any way with the common styles of talking about art, that the chorus is the ideal spectator, or had the job of standing in for the people over against the royal area of the scene. The last mentioned point, a conceptual explanation which sounds so lofty for many politicians, as though the invariable moral law was presented by the democratic Athenians in the people's chorus, which was always proved right in matters dealing with their king's passionate acts of violence and excess, may have been suggested by a word from Aristotle. But such an idea has no influence on the original formation of tragedy, since all the opposition between people and ruler and every political social issue in general is excluded from those purely religious origins. Looking with hindsight back on the classical form of the chorus, known to us in Aeschylus and Sophocles, we might well consider it blasphemous to talk of a premonition of the, quote, constitutional popular representation, end quote, here. Others, however, have not been deterred from this blasphemous assertion. The ancient political organizations had no practical knowledge of a constitutional popular representation, and they never once had a hopeful premonition of such things in their tragedies. Much more famous than this political explanation of the chorus is A. W. Schlegel's idea. He recommended that we consider the chorus to some extent as a sample embodiment of the crowd of onlookers, as the ideal spectator. This view, combined with that historical tradition that originally the tragedy consisted entirely of the chorus, reveals itself for what it is, a crude and unscholarly, although dazzling, claim. But the glitter survives only in the concept form of the expression, from the real Germanic prejudice for everything which is called ideal, and from our momentary astonishment. For we are astonished as soon as we compare the theater public we know well with that chorus and ask ourselves whether it would be at all possible on the basis of this public to derive some idealization analogous to the tragic chorus. We silently deny this and then are surprised by the audacity of Schlegel's claim, as well as by the totally different nature of the Greek general public. For we had always thought that the proper spectator, whoever he might be, must always remain conscious that he has a work of art in front of him, not an empirical reality. By contrast, the tragic chorus of the Greeks is required to recognize the shapes on the stage as living, existing people. The chorus of Oceanids really believe that they see the Titan Prometheus in front of them, and consider themselves every bit as real as the god of the scene. And is that supposed to be the highest and purest type of spectator, a person who, like the Oceanids, considers Prometheus vitally alive and real? Would it be a mark of the ideal spectator to run up to the stage and free the god from his torment? We had believed in the aesthetic public and considered the individual spectator sufficiently capable, the more he was in a position to take the work of art as art, that is, aesthetically. This saying of Schlegel's indicates to us that the completely ideal spectator lets the scenic world work on him, not aesthetically at all, but vitally and empirically. Oh, what about those Greeks? We sigh. They are knocking over our aesthetics. But once we get used to that idea, we repeat Schlegel's saying every time we talk about the chorus. But that emphatic tradition speaks here against Schlegel. The chorus in itself, without the stage, that is, the primitive form of tragedy, and that chorus of ideal spectators are not compatible. What sort of artistic style would we have from this idea of the spectator we derived as its essential form, the spectator in himself, the pure spectator? The spectator without a play is a contradictory idea. We suspect that the birth of tragedy cannot be explained either from the high estimation of the moral intelligence of the masses or from the idea of the spectator without a play. And we consider this problem too profound to be touched by such superficial styles of commentary. Schiller has already provided an infinitely more valuable insight into the meaning of the chorus in the famous preface to The Bride from Messina. The chorus viewed as a living wall, which tragedy draws about itself in order to separate itself cleanly from the real world and to protect its ideal space and its poetical freedom for itself. With this as his main weapon, Schiller fought against the common idea of naturalism, against the common demand of illusionistic dramatic poetry. While in the theater, daytime might be only artistic and stage architecture only symbolic, and the nature of the metrical language might have an ideal quality, nevertheless, on the whole, a misconception still ruled. It was not enough, Schiller claimed, that people merely tolerated as poetic freedom what was the essence of all poetry. The introduction of the chorus, according to Schiller, was the decisive step with which war was declared openly and nobly against naturalism in art. Such a way of looking at things is the one, it strikes me, for which our age, which considers itself so superior, uses the dismissive catchphrase pseudo-idealism. I suspect by contrast that with our present worship of naturalism and realism, we are situated at the opposite pole from all idealism, namely in the region of a waxworks collection. In that too there is an art, as in certain romance novels of the present time. Only let no one pester us with the claim that with this we have overthrown the artistic pseudo-idealism of Schiller and Goethe. Of course, it is an quote-unquote ideal stage on which, following Schiller's correct insight, the Greek satyr chorus, the chorus of the primitive tragedy, customarily strolled, a stage lifted high above over the real strolling stage of mortal men. For this chorus, the Greeks constructed a suspended hovering framework of an imaginary natural condition, and on it placed imaginary natural beings. Tragedy grew up out of this foundation, and for that very reason has from its inception been spared the embarrassing business of counterfeiting reality. That is not to say that it is a world arbitrarily fantasized somewhere between heaven and earth. It is much rather a world possessing the same reality and credibility for the devout Greek as the world of Olympus, together with its inhabitants. The satyr, as the Dionysian chorus member, lives in a reality permitted by religion, sanctioned by myth and culture. The fact that tragedy begins with him, that out of him the Dionysian wisdom of tragedy speaks, is a phenomenon as foreign to us here as the development of tragedy out of the chorus generally. Perhaps we can reach a starting point for this discussion when I offer the claim that the satyr himself, the imaginary natural being, is related to the cultural person in the same way that Dionysian music is related to civilization. On this last point, Richard Wagner states that civilization is neutralized by music, in the same way lamplight is by daylight. In just such a manner, I believe, the cultured Greek felt himself neutralized by the sight of the chorus of satyrs. This is the most direct effect of Dionysian tragedy. Generally, the state and society, the gap between man and man, give way to an invincible feeling of unity, which leads back to the heart of nature. The metaphysical consolation which, as I have already indicated, true tragedy leaves us, that at the bottom of everything, in spite of all the transformations and phenomena, Life is indestructibly power and delightful. This consolation appears in lively clarity as the chorus of satyrs, the chorus of natural beings, who live, as it were, behind civilization, who cannot disappear, and who, in spite of all the changes and generations and a people's history, always remain the same. With this chorus, the profound Greek, capable of the most delicate and most severe suffering, consoled himself. The man who looked around with a daring gaze in the middle of the terrifying destructive instincts of so-called world history, and equally into the cruelty of nature, and who is in danger of longing for the denial of the will of Buddhism. Art saves him, and through art life saves him. The ecstasy of the Dionysian state, with its destruction of the customary manacles and boundaries of existence, contains, of course, for as long as it lasts, a lethargic element, in which everything personally experienced in the past is immersed. Through this gulf of oblivion, the world of everyday reality and the Dionysian reality separate from each other. As soon as that daily reality comes back again into consciousness, one feels it as something disgusting. The fruit of this condition is an ascetic condition, in which one denies the power of the will. In this sense, the Dionysian man has similarities to Hamlet. Both have had a real glimpse into the essence of things. They have understood, and it now disgusts them to act, for their actions can change nothing in the eternal nature of things. They perceive as ridiculous or humiliating the fact that it is expected of them that they should set right a world turned upside down. The knowledge kills action, for action requires a state of being in which we are covered with the veil of illusion. That is what Hamlet has to teach us, not that really venal wisdom about John a Dreams, who cannot move himself to act because of too much reflection, too many possibilities, so to speak. It's not a case of reflection. No. The true knowledge, the glimpse into the cruel truth, overcomes the driving motive to act, both in Hamlet as well as in the Dionysian man. Now, no consolation has any effect. His longing goes out over the world, even beyond the gods themselves, toward death. Existence is denied, together with its blazing reflection in the gods or an immortal afterlife. In the consciousness of once having glimpsed the truth, man now sees everywhere only the horror or absurdity of being. Now he understands the symbolism in the fate of Ophelia. Now he recognizes the wisdom of the forest god Silenus. It disgusts him. Here the will is in the highest danger. Thus, to be saved, it comes close to the healing magician Art. Art alone can turn those thoughts of disgust at the horror or absurdity of existence into imaginary constructs which permit living to continue. These constructs are the sublime, as the artistic mastering of the horrible, and the comic as the artistic release from disgust at the absurd. The chorus of satyrs in the Dithrium is the saving fact of Greek art. The emotional fits I have just described play themselves out by means of the world of these Dionysian attendants. Section 8. The satyr and the idyllic shepherd of our more recent times are both the epitome of a longing directed toward the primordial and natural, but with what a strong, fearless grip the Greek held on to his men from the woods, and how timidly and weakly modern man toys with the flattering image of a delicate and gentle flute-playing shepherd. The Greek, who had not been worked on yet by any knowledge which kept culture imprisoned, saw nature in his satyr, and so he did not yet mistake satyrs for apes. Quite to the contrary, the satyr was the primordial image of man, the expression of his highest and strongest emotions as an inspired reveler, enraptured by the approach of the god as a sympathetic companion, in whom the suffering of the god was repeated as a messenger bringing wisdom from the deepest heart of nature, as a perceptible image of the sexual omnipotence of nature, which the Greek was accustomed to observing with a reverent astonishment. The satyr was something sublime and divine. That's how he must have seemed, especially to the painfully broken gaze of the Dionysian man, who would have been insulted by our well-groomed fictitious shepherd. His eye lingered with sublime satisfaction on the exposed, vigorous, and magnificent script of nature. Here the illusion of culture was wiped away by the primordial image of man. Here the real man revealed himself, the bearded satyr who cried out with joy to his god. In comparison with him, the man of culture was reduced to a misleading caricature. Schiller was also right to see in these matters the start of tragic art. The chorus is a living wall against the pounding reality, because it, the satyr chorus, presents existence more genuinely, truly, and completely than does the civilized person, who generally considers himself the only reality. The sphere of poetry does not lie beyond this world as the fantastic impossibility of a poet's brain. It wants to be exactly the opposite, the unadorned expression of the truth, and it must therefore cast off the false costume of that truth thought up by the man of culture. The contrast of this real truth of nature and the cultural lie which behaves as if it was the only reality is similar to the contrast between the eternal core of things, the thing in itself, and the total world of appearances. And just as tragedy with its metaphysical consolation draws attention to the eternal life of that existential core in the continuing destruction of appearances, so the symbolism of the satyr chorus already expresses metaphorically that primordial relationship between the thing in itself and appearances. That idyllic shepherd of modern man is only a counterfeit, the totality of cultural illusions which he counts as nature. The Dionysian Greek wants truth and nature in their highest power. He seems himself transformed into a satyr. The enraptured horde of those who served Dionysus rejoiced under the influence of such moods and insights, whose power transformed them before their very eyes, so that they imagined themselves as restored natural geniuses, as satyrs. The later constitution of the tragic chorus is the artistic imitation of that natural phenomenon, in which now a division was surely necessary between the Dionysian spectators and those under the Dionysian enchantment. But we must always remind ourselves that the public in Attic tragedy rediscovered itself in chorus of the orchestra, and that basically there was no opposition between the public and the chorus. For everything is only a huge sublime chorus of dancing and singing satyrs, or of those people who permit themselves to be represented by these satyrs. We must now appropriate that saying of Schlegel's in a deeper sense. The chorus is the quote-unquote ideal spectator, insofar as it is the only onlooker, the person who sees the visionary world of the scene. A public of spectators as we know it was unknown to the Greeks. In their theater, given the way the spectator space was built up in terraces, raised up in the concentric rings, it was possible for everyone quite literally to look out over the collective, cultural world around him and with a complete perspective to imagine himself a member of the chorus. Given this insight, we can call the chorus and its primitive stages of the prototypical tragedy the self-reflection of the Dionysian men, a phenomenon which we can make out most clearly in the experience of the actor, who, if he is really gifted, sees perceptibly before his eyes the image of the role he has to play, hovering there for him to grasp. The satyr chorus is, first and foremost, a vision of the Dionysian mass, just as in turn the world of the acting area is a vision of this satyr chorus. The power of this vision is strong enough to dull and desensitize the impression of reality, the sight of the cultured people ranged in their rows of seats all around. The form of the Greek theater is a reminder of a solitary mountain valley. The architecture of the scene appears as an illuminated picture of a cloud, which the Bacchae gaze upon, as they swarm down from the mountain heights, as the majestic setting in the middle of which the image of Dionysus is revealed. This primitive artistic illusion, which we are putting into words here to explain the tragic chorus, is, from the perspective of our scholarly views about the basic artistic process, almost offensive, although nothing can be more obvious than that the poet is only a poet because of the fact that he sees himself surrounded by shapes which live and act in front of him, and into whose innermost being he gazes. Through some peculiar weakness in our modern talent, we are inclined to imagine that primitive aesthetic phenomenon in too complicated and abstract a manner. For the true poet, metaphor is not a rhetorical trope, but a representative image which really hovers in front of him in the place of an idea. The character is for him not a totality put together from individual traits collected bit by bit, but a living person, insistently there before his eyes, which differs from the similar vision of the painter only through its continued further living and acting. Why does Homer give us descriptions so much more vivid than all the poets? Because he sees so much more around him. We speak about poetry so abstractly because we all tend to be poor poets. The aesthetic phenomenon is fundamentally simple. If someone just possesses the capacity to see a living game going on and to live all the time surrounded by hordes of ghosts, then that man is a poet. If someone just feels the urge to change himself and speak out from the other bodies and souls, then that person is a dramatist. Dionysian excitement is capable of communicating this artistic talent to an entire multitude, so that they see themselves surrounded by such a horde of ghosts, with which they know that they are innerly one. This dynamic of the tragic chorus is the original dramatic phenomenon. To see oneself transformed before one's eyes, and now to act as if one had really entered another body, another character. This process stands right at the beginning of the development of drama. Here is something different from the rhapsodist, who never fuses with his images, but, like the painter, sees them with an observing eye outside himself. In this drama there is already a surrender of individuality by entering into a strange nature. And this phenomenon breaks out like an epidemic. An entire horde feels itself enchanted in this way. For this reason, the dithyramb is essentially different from every other choral song. The virgins who move solemnly to Apollo's temple with laurel branches in their hands, singing a processional song as they go, remain who they are and retain their names as citizens. The dithyrambic chorus is a chorus of transformed people, for whom their civic past, their social position is completely forgotten. They have become their God's timeless servants, living beyond all regions of society. All other choral lyrics of the Greeks are only an immense intensification of the Apollonian solo singer, whereas in the dithyramb a congregation of unconscious actors stands before us, who look upon each other as transformed. Enchantment is the precondition for all dramatic art. In this enchantment, the Dionysian reveler sees himself as a satyr, and then, in turn, as a satyr he looks at his god. That is, in his transformed state, he sees a new vision outside himself as an Apollonian fulfillment of his condition. With this new vision, drama is complete. With this knowledge in mind, we must understand Greek tragedy as the Dionysian chorus, which over and over again constantly discharges itself in an Apollonian world of images. Those choral passages interspersed through tragedy are thus, as it were, the maternal bosom of the entire dialogue, so called, that is, of the totality of the stage world, the drama itself. This primordial basis of tragedy sends its vision pulsing out in several discharges, following one after the other, a vision which is entirely a dream image and therefore epic in nature. But, on the other hand, as an objectification of a Dionysian state, it presents not the Apollonian consolation in illusion, but its opposite, the smashing of individuality and becoming one with the primordial being. With this, drama is the Apollonian projection of Dionysian knowledge and effects, and thus is separated by an immense gulf from epic. This conception of ours provides a full explanation for the chorus of Greek tragedy, the symbol for the total frenzied Dionysian multitude. While, given what we are used to with the role of the chorus on the modern stage, especially the chorus in opera, we are totally unable to grasp how this tragic chorus could be older, more original, even more important than the real quote-unquote action, as tradition tells us so clearly. While we cannot then figure out why, given that traditionally high importance and original preeminence, that chorus would be put together only out of lowly serving creatures, at first only out of goat-like satyrs, and while for us the orchestra in front of the acting area remains a constant enigma, we have now come to the insight that the acting area, together with the action, is basically and originally thought of only as a vision, that the single reality is the chorus itself, which creates the vision out of itself, and speaks of that with the entire symbolism of dance, tone, and word. This chorus in its vision gazes at its lord and master, Dionysus, and is thus always the chorus of servants. The chorus sees how Dionysus, the god, suffers and glorifies himself, and thus it does not itself act. But in this role, as complete servants in relation to the god, the chorus is nevertheless the highest, that is, the Dionysian, expression of nature, and like nature, thus in its frenzy speaks the language of oracular wisdom, as the sympathetic as well as a wise person reporting the truth from the heart of the world. So arises that fantastic and apparently offensive figure of the wise and frenzied satyr, who is, at the same time, the naive man, in contrast to the god, an image of nature and its strongest drives, a symbol of that, and at the same time, the announcer of its wisdom and art, musician, poet, dancer, visionary, in a single person. According to this insight and to the tradition, Dionysus, the essential stage hero and center of the vision, was not really present in the very oldest periods of tragedy, but was only imagined as present. That is, originally, tragedy was only chorus and not drama. Later the attempt was made to show the god as real, and then to present in a way visible to every eye the form of the vision together with the transfiguring setting. At that point, drama, in the strict sense, begins. Now the dithyrambic chorus takes on the task of stimulating the mood of the listeners, right up to the Dionysian level, so that when the tragic hero appeared on the stage, they did not see something like an awkward, masked person, but a visionary shape born, as it were, out of their own enchantment. If we imagine Admetus thinking deeply about his recently departed wife, Alcestis, and pining away in his spiritual contemplation of her, and how suddenly is led up to him an image of a woman of similar form and similar gait, but in disguise, if we imagine his sudden trembling anticipation, his emotional comparisons, his instinctive conviction, then we have an analogy to the sensation with which the aroused Dionysian spectator sees the god stride onto the stage, with whose suffering he has already become one. Spontaneously, he transfers the whole picture of the god, which like magic trembles in his soul, onto that masked form, and dissolves the reality of that figure as if in a ghostly unreality. This is the Apollonian dream state, in which the world of day veils itself in a new world, clearer, more comprehensible, more moving than the first, and yet shadow, like generates itself anew in a continuing series of changes before our eyes. With this in mind, we can recognize in tragedy a drastic contrast of styles. Speech, color, movement, dynamics of speech appear in the Dionysian lyric of the chorus, and also in the Apollonian dream world of the scene as expressive spheres completely separate from each other. The Apollonian illusions, in which Dionysus objectifies himself, are no longer an eternal sea, a changing, weaving motion, a glowing sense of living, as is the case with the music of the chorus, no longer those powers which are only felt and cannot be turned into poetic images, in which the frenzied servant of Dionysus feels the approach of the god. Now, from the acting area, the clarity and solemnity of the epic form speaks to him. Now Dionysus no longer speaks through forces, but as an epic hero, almost with the language of Homer. Section 9. Everything which comes to the surface in the Apollonian part of Greek tragedy, in the dialogue, looks simple, translucent, and beautiful. In this sense, the dialogue is an image of the Greeks, whose nature reveals itself in dancing, because in dancing the greatest power is only latent, betraying its presence in the lithe and rich movement. The language of the Sophoclean hero surprises us by its Apollonian clarity and brightness, so that we immediately imagine that we are glimpsing the innermost basis of their being, with some astonishment that the path to this foundation is so short. However, once we look away from the character of the hero as its surfaces become perceptible, a character which is basically nothing more than a light picture cast onto a dark wall, that is, an illusion through and through, we penetrate further into the myth, which projects itself into the bright reflection. At that point, we suddenly experience a phenomenon which is the reverse of a well-known optical one. When we make a determined attempt to look directly at the sun and turn away blinded, we have dark-colored specks in front of our eyes, like a remedy. Those illuminated, illusory pictures of the Sophoclean heroes are the reverse of that. Briefly put, the Apollonian of the Mask, necessary creations of a glimpse into the inner terror of nature, are like bright spots to heal us from the horrifying night of the disabled gaze. Only in this sense can we think of correctly grasping the serious and significant idea of Greek serenity, whereas nowadays we run into the false idea of this as a condition of safe contentment with all life's paths and bridges. The most painful figure of the Greek stage, the unlucky Oedipus, is understood by Sophocles as the noble man who was destined for error and misery in spite of his wisdom, but who at the end, through his immense suffering, exerts a beneficial effect around him, which is effective on those different from him. The noble man does not sin. That's what the profound poet wishes to tell us. Through Oedipus's actions, every law, every natural principle of order, indeed, the entire moral world may collapse. But because of these actions, a higher circle of consequences is created, which will found a new world on the ruins of the old world, which has been overthrown. Insofar as the poet is also a religious thinker, that is what he says to us. As a poet, he shows us first a wonderfully complicated legal knot, which the judge, link by link, undoes, in the process destroying himself. The real joy for the Greek in this dialectical solution is so great that a sense of powerful serenity invests the entire work, which breaks the sting of the dreadful preconditions which started the process. In Oedipus at Colonus, we run into this same serenity, but elevated by an immeasurable transformation. Unlike the old man afflicted with excessive suffering, a man who merely suffers as the victim of everything which happens to him, now we have the unearthly serenity which descends from the sphere of the gods and indicates to us that the hero, in his purely passive conduct, achieves his highest action, which reaches out far over his own life, whereas his conscious striving in his earlier life led him to pure passivity. Thus, for the mortal eye, the inextricably tangled legal knot of the Oedipus story is slowly untangled, and the most profound human joy suffuses us with this divine dialectical companion piece. If we have here correctly explained the poet, one can still ask whether the content of the myth has been exhausted in that explanation. And here we see that the entire conception of the poet is nothing other than that illuminated image which nature as healer holds up before us after a glimpse into the abyss. Oedipus, the murderer of his father, the husband of his mother. Oedipus, the solver of the riddle of the Sphinx. What does the secret trinity of these fatal events tell us? There is a very ancient folk belief, especially in Persia, that a wise magus could be born only out of incest. With hindsight on Oedipus as the solver of riddles and emancipator of his mother, what we have to interpret right away is the fact that right there where, through prophecy and magical powers, the spell of present and future is broken, that rigid law of individuation and the essential magic of nature in general, then an immense natural horror, for example incest, must have come first as the original cause. For how could we compel nature to yield up its secrets, if not for the fact that we fight back against her and win? That is, if not for the fact that we commit unnatural actions. I see this idea stamped out in that dreadful trinity of Oedipus's three fates. The same man who solved the riddle of nature, the ambiguous Sphinx, must also break the most sacred natural laws when he murders his father and marries his mother. Indeed, the myth seems to want to whisper to us that wisdom, especially Dionysian wisdom, is something horrific and hostile to nature, that a man who through his knowledge pushes nature into the destructive abyss has to experience in himself the disintegration of nature. Quote, "The lance of knowledge turns itself against the wise man. Wisdom is a crime against nature." End quote. The myth calls out such frightening statements to us, but like a ray of sunlight, the Greek poet touches the sublime in fearful Memnon's column of myth, so that the myth suddenly begins to play out Sophoclean melodies. Now I'm going to compare the glory of passivity with the glory of activity, which illuminates Aeschylus's Prometheus. What Aeschylus the thinker had to say to us here, but what Aeschylus as a poet could only hint at through a metaphorical picture, that's what young Goethe knew how to reveal in the bold words of his Prometheus. Quote, "Here I sit, I make men in my own image, a race like me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy life and rejoice, and then to pay no attention like me." End quote. Man, rising up into something titanic, is victorious over his own culture, and compels the gods to unite with him, because in his self-controlled wisdom he holds their existence and the limits to their authority in his hand. The most marvelous thing in that poem of Prometheus, which is, according to its basic concepts, is a hymn celebrating impiety, is, however, the deep Aeschylean impulse for justice. The immeasurable suffering of the brave quote-unquote individual on the one hand, and on the other, the peril faced by the gods, even a presentiment of the twilight of the gods, the compelling power for a metaphysical oneness, for a reconciliation of both these worlds of suffering. All this is a powerful reminder of the central point and major claim of the Aeschylean worldview, which sees fate, Mora, enthroned over gods and men as eternal justice. With respect to the astonishing daring with which Aeschylus places the Olympian world on his scales of justice, we must remind ourselves that the deep-thinking Greek had an unshakably firm basis for metaphysical thinking in his mystery cults, and that he could unload all his skeptical moods onto the Olympians. The Greek artist in particular, in looking back on these divinities, felt a dark sense of reciprocal dependency, and this sense is symbolized especially in Aeschylus's Prometheus. The Titanic artist, Prometheus, found in himself the defiant belief that he could make men, and at the very least, destroy Olympian gods. All this through his higher wisdom, which he of course was compelled to atone for in eternal suffering. The magnificent capability of the great genius for whom eternal suffering itself is too cheap a price, the harsh pride of the artist, that is the content and soul of Aeschylean poetry, whereas Sophocles in his Oedipus makes his case by sounding out the victory song of the holy man. But also this meaning which Aeschylus gave the myth does not fill the astonishing depth of its terror. The artist's joy in being, the serenity of artistic creativity in spite of that impiety, is only a light picture of cloud and sky, which mirrors itself in a dark ocean of sorrow. The Prometheus saga is a primordial possession of the Aryan population, collectively in documentary evidence of their talent for the profoundly tragic. In fact, it could be the case that for the Aryan being, this myth has the same defining meaning as the myth of the fall has for the Semitic peoples, and that both myths are, to some degree, related as brother and sister. The precondition of this Prometheus myth is the extraordinary value which a naive humanity associates with fire as the true divine protector of that rising culture. But the fact that man freely controls fire and does not receive it merely as a gift from heaven as a stirring lightning flash or warning rays of the sun appeared to these contemplative primitive men as an outrage, a crime against divine nature. And so right there, the first philosophical problem posed an awkward, insoluble contradiction between man and God, and pushed it right up to the door of that culture like a boulder. The best and loftiest thing which mankind can share is achieved through a crime, and people must now accept further consequences, namely the entire flood of suffering and troubles with which the offended divine presences afflict the nobly ambitious human race. Such things must happen, an austere notion which, through the value which it gives to a crime, stands in a curious contrast to the Semitic myth of the fall, in which curiosity, lying falsehoods, temptation, lust, in short, a row of predominantly female emotions, are looked upon as the origin of evil. What distinguishes the Aryan conception is the lofty view of an active transgression as the essentially Promethean virtue. With this, the ethical basis of pessimistic tragedy is established together with the justification of human evil, that is, human guilt as the penalty for that sin. The impiety in the essence of things, that's what the thinking Aryan is not inclined to quibble away. The contradiction in the heart of the world reveals itself to him as the interpenetration of different worlds, for example, a divine and human world, each one of which is right in its separate way, but which must suffer for its individuality as the two worlds come close together. With this heroic push of the individual into the universal, with this attempt to stride out over the limits of individuation and to wish to be oneself a world being, man suffers in himself the contradiction hidden in things. That is, he violates the laws and he suffers. Just as among the Aryans crime is seen as male, and among the Semites sin is seen as female, so the original crime was committed by a man, the original sin by a woman. In this connection, the chorus of witches in Goethe's Faust says, "We're not so particular in what we say. Woman takes 1,000 steps to get her way. But no matter how quickly she hurries on, with just one leap the man will get it done." Anyone who understands this innermost core of the Prometheus saga, namely the imperative requirement that the individual striving like a titan has to fall into crime, must also sense at the same time the un-Apollonian quality of this pessimistic concept. For Apollo wants to make these separate individual worlds tranquil precisely because he establishes the borderline between them and, with his demands for self-knowledge and moderation, always reminds us once again of the most sacred laws of the world. However, to prevent this Apollonian tendency from freezing form into Egyptian stiffness and frigidity, and to prevent the movement of the entire ocean from dying away, through the attempts of the Apollonian tendency to prescribe to the individual waves their path and extent, from time to time the high flood of the Dionysian destroys those small circles, in which the one-sided Apollonian will seek to confine the Greek spirit. Now suddenly a tidal wave of the Dionysian takes the single small individual crests on its back, just as the brother of Prometheus, the Titan Atlas, shouldered the earth. This titanic impulse to become something like the Atlas of all individuals, and to bear them on one's wide back, higher and higher, further and further, is the common link between the Promethean and the Dionysian. In this view, the Aeschylean Prometheus is a Dionysian mask, while in that previously mentioned deep desire for justice, Aeschylus betrays to those who understand his paternal descent from Apollo, the god of individuation and the limits of justice. And the double nature of the Aeschylean Prometheus, his simultaneously Dionysian and Apollonian nature, can be expressed in an understandable way with the following words. Quote, "Everything present is just and unjust, and both aspects are equally justified." End quote. That is your world. That's what one calls a world. This is the end of part 2 of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.